Hi everyone, welcome. Thanks for being here tonight. My name's Bryn Durgan and I'm the Director of Programming here at Bookstore One. And for those of you who've been in the loft before, you know that we do a whole lot of programming. We have author talks like you'll see here tonight, Spanish literary salons, book clubs, writing workshops, and it wouldn't be possible if it weren't for customers like all of you. So again, thanks for being here. Okay, now before I introduce you to the author that you're here to see, can everyone just make sure their phone is silenced or off? And while you're doing that, I'll just tell you a little bit about how the evening will go. The two of us will be in conversation, and then we'll turn it over to you to ask questions, audience questions, and then we'll end with a book signing right downstairs where you can pick up the book that you have got to get today. Okay, so let me introduce you to the author of the hour. Okay, he is the author of Bone Valley, a true story of injustice and redemption in the heart of Florida. He is also the host and producer of Bone Valley, a multi-part narrative podcast about the wrongful conviction of Leo Schofield. He is also the author of Devil in the Grove, which was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction in 2013. A New York Times bestseller, the book was also named a runner-up for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. He has written about race, civil rights, and the death penalty for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and he was a 2019-2020 fellow at the Dorothy and Louis B. Coleman Center for Writers and Scholars at the New York Public Library. His earlier books include The Execution of Willie Francis from 2008 and Beneath a Ruthless Sun from 2018. He lives in Brooklyn, New York. So please join me in welcoming the brilliant Gilbert King.
I don't know about brilliant, that's what I said.
Okay, so for those in the audience that might be unfamiliar with Bone Valley, can you just introduce us to what drew you to this case and tell us a little bit about Leo?
Yeah, I mean, I'll do the part of the story that's just the most interesting to me was that I was down in Naples doing a talk at a judicial conference, and a judge handed me a card, and all it said was Leo Schofield's name, and it said, not just wrongfully convicted, he's an innocent man. And I remember thinking, like, judges are not supposed to do that. Like, Charles Williams, you could tell me that, that's true, that's an ethical canon of some sort of violation. But he was basically, you're not supposed to criticize the criminal justice system if you're a sitting judge. But that's what he was doing. He was saying, you know, this man was framed. He wasn't saying it was, you know, a mistake, tunnel vision. He was walking me through this later, that this case, a prosecutor framed Leo Schofield, and he'd been in prison for 30 years, and he'd exhausted all his appeals. And so that's how I kind of got the knowledge of this case. And I remember just, after like looking through it, reading as much as I could, he was sending me things. I'd ask a lot of questions. I said, well, I'm interested now. You know, I'm putting away another project. I'm really interested in this. And he says, I think it's time you meet Leo. And so that's what we did. We went into the prison back in early 2019. Yeah, it's almost 6 years ago, 7 years, I don't know, it's a long time ago. And went in to meet him. And I remember thinking, maybe I'll write like a feature story for the New York Times or something like that about his case, because I thought it was interesting. But after hearing him talk and tell these stories, and just feeling that urgency of somebody who's like, basically, we spent 3 hours with him, and he's reliving the worst moments of his life with us. And when I say us, it was my research assistant at the time was Kelsey Decker. We went in together, and they gave us 3 hours with him. They just let him talk because he was so beloved in the prison that they just, oh yeah, however long you want to stay. And you know, I don't think he'd ever talked about these stories. Like, what is it like to, you know, have your wife not come home one night and you're freaking out, wondering where she is, and you know, hours go by, the next day, what it's like waking up the next morning. You know, we've all woken up that next morning after something bad's happened the day before, and you're kind of hoping it's a dream, and it's not, and realizing, oh my God, my wife is missing, and this was what he was living through. And the search and all of this, the trial, he was just recounting all this. And you know, you could just feel the anguish and the passion and the urgency in his voice. And I mean urgency. This man had been in prison for 30 years, and I think it was clear to him that some writer coming in might be his last chance at something, changing the story, something. And so we felt that, and I'll just say, like, that's how it turned into a podcast because I felt like it wasn't like quotes on a page anymore. It was like we needed to hear that thick, New England accent and how emotional he got describing the things. He's very articulate. And that's when I just decided, well, this should be an audio documentary that people should hear what we just heard.
Right, and so many of the people at the center of your work, including Leo, of course, have spent decades trying to be heard. So I'm wondering what the process of building trust with a person like that, how do you go about that?
Well, I'll be honest with you. I don't know if the trust thing was, he had nobody else was interested in this. And then all of a sudden some guy from New York who has a Pulitzer Prize wants to meet with you. Like, he was like, I'm going to trust you on this.
Why not?
Yeah, and he just had nothing to lose at this point. And so I think that was just, I think there were some things where I think he was feeling me out, like, where do you want to go with this? But the one thing he said to me, which has always resonated and has always been true, he just said, my story's not going to change. I am innocent of this, and I will never, you'll never find anything that's going to make me look guilty. It just can't happen. And that's the way he sort of approached it with me. I'm an open book. Ask me whatever you want. Some of it's not going to look very flattering. I'm going to have to live with that. But I am going to, by the time you finish a real investigation, you're going to find out what I already know. I'm innocent.
And now, so of course, Bowen Valley exists as a book and also as a podcast. Podcast first, book later. How did the two affect one another, those two forms of storytelling?
Yeah, well, it was really interesting because I'd never done a podcast before. I didn't know what I was doing, but I knew that the story was there from an audio sense. So usually my books are set like in the pre-civil rights era in, the 1940s. And everybody's pretty much dead. I'm dealing with documents. I'm not dealing with living human beings. So that took some getting used to. I can just tell you, I can't tell you how much tape I ruined in interviews where I'd ask a question and someone would start giving an answer. I'm like, no, you don't say, really? No, that, it's just like.
Which is so human, though. That's so human.
It is, and it works really well for books, but I had to learn to shut up and do the thing where you see it on TV sometimes where someone's talking and the interviewer's just going, keep talking, I'm not going to say anything. And I found myself doing that. I guess you have to do that. But the reason I was not planning on doing a book on this. I thought the audio, the podcast, that'll be fine. But then I realized there's so much that I couldn't really include, especially the trial. This trial was not recorded, audio or even television, back in 1987. So I couldn't really rely on that for the podcast. And so there were some really interesting things that happened in the trial that I just had to sort of not, you don't want to hear me reading trial transcripts on an audio, right, on a podcast. So I just realized there's so many scenes I'm missing here that I'm not being able to dive into. And a lot of the research that I really like to do in my books, I kind of had to take it a little easy on that and tone it down a little bit for the audio, for the podcast. And so towards the end, I said, I left out so much. I got to write a book. And fortunately, I had an editor approach me and said, who's doing the book? I said, nobody yet. He ended up being the guy.
Nice. And at what point through this process did you begin to write the book?
It was really late. It was at least 5 years after I started. I had hundreds and hundreds of pages of notes and outlines about stories, and I wanted to tell this a little bit differently. I was thinking about I don't know, has anyone ever read Eric Larson's Devil in the White City? Yeah, okay, it's a great classic narrative nonfiction. It also is the book that makes a lot of writers like me really jealous because they get to do a parallel narrative. It's about the World's Fair in Chicago and back in the 19th century. And you have the architect who's building it and a serial killer who's taking women who come there to work there and disappearing them. And so this is all happening right in Chicago, and the parallel narrative of that is just fascinating. And I think every nonfiction writer wants to do something like that. It just doesn't always work out. You can't figure out a way to do it. I couldn't really make it work. It worked in my head, but it did not work on the page. And so part of the reason is because there's some things that happen that need to be revealed at a certain time. You can't just go back and forth and have a strange character. Why are we paying attention to this guy? So I couldn't really make that work, but I got close to what I wanted. And I felt that this really worked well, especially as the end started shifting, because a lot of things that happened in this book happened after the podcast came out. It was still ongoing, and so that's why it really worked better.
Okay, so you mentioned Chicago and Devil in the White City. So Florida appears in your work over and over again, and not just as a setting, of course, but really as a character. And I'm wondering what you think what does Florida reveal about the American story that might be harder to see in other places of the country?
Yeah, I really wish I had a great answer for you, but I'm going to go back to one answer that I've often thought about. I don't know if anyone's ever seen this movie, The People versus Larry Flynt. It's a story about Larry Flynt was a pornographer back in the 70s and 80s from Ohio. And I think he got shot by an assassin. He was in a wheelchair. But he was continually going into court and having his case heard. And the movie, Woody Harrelson plays Larry Flynt, and Ed Norton plays his lawyer. And Ed Norton is just exasperated with Larry Flynt, because the judge will say, you have to stay here in Ohio, you cannot go anywhere, you have trial. And he would just get on his private jet and take off. And Ed Norton just approached him at the airport one time, right in front of his jet. And he said, I can't take this anymore. I can't take it. I quit. You're impossible to work with. And Larry Flynt says, why would you want to quit me? I'm rich and I'm always in trouble. And I feel like that's Florida to me. It's like the third largest state, and there's just always trouble everywhere you look. And I just feel like that really epitomizes the state to me. But I will say, and I'm not trying to say this for any reason, I love Florida, I really do. I love the people I've met here. Everybody helps me so much. I can't tell you, like the help I get from academics, attorneys, prosecutors, judges, politicians. Sometimes they just help him out. He needs the records, and they'll get me records. It's unbelievable. So I love working down here, and the sunshine law,
Right. Yeah. I mean, and you've got a reputation now, so I think that that helps. Yeah, I wonder, is there a certain a moment that felt especially Florida from your reporting?
I think one of the things that really was kind of stunning to me is, like, when I first started putting together this tape that we were collecting, the accents are all over the place, and that's Florida too, right? Like you get some Southerners, like in Central and North Florida, but then you get the Boston guys like Leo, and some of the cops who come down from the Northeast or the Midwest. Then you get these Chicago accents coming in, and so that's just, to me, is very Florida, and it's a melting pot of people. And I think if you look at this state, it does not just attract snowbirds, but it attracts that criminal element, like people have fun. And so, they end up down in Florida all the time.
So people run here.
Yeah, exactly. Where do you think you're gonna hide in any state, but they always come to Florida.
I know. So I wonder, what has Leo's reaction been to the book?
Oh, his reaction, he's very honest with me about this stuff, and he says, if it wasn't for this story, I would still be in prison. I was never getting out of prison. Like, they had already determined that. And I think the attention that the podcast got was what really put the spotlight on him. And so when we go into court, instead of things happening in the darkness and the media coverage being pretty slight, there was really no accountability for the state for what they had done to him, and it wasn't being covered, so nobody thought anything was wrong.
Yeah.
But I think, after, especially the book, I think one time he was reading it around me, and I heard him laughing. I'm like, what are you laughing? Like, there's not many jokes in this story. And I forget what he was laughing about, but he would hear him laughing every once in a while. But it was just basically how I would describe him at times. At one time I said he looked like a young Freddie Mercury, which he did. If you saw his long hair, and he did kind of look that way. And he thought that was hilarious.
I wonder how it's felt too, through the podcast in particular, sort of searching for the truth while an audience is witnessing it in real time. What was that experience like? You don't get that with a book, for example.
No, you don't. I mean, it was just like immediate, and it really took off, and we were surprised. We didn't know, nobody knew what was going to happen. We just knew we had a good story, and that's all. But that's no guarantee of anything. But then it started to take off, and we're finding out, like, millions of people are listening to this thing, and they're like binging it, and they're addicted to it, and they're going on social media, and they're starting, everyone has a petition. Like any wrongful convicted person, like, their family puts together a petition. Leo's was like just 10,000, 20,000, 30,000. It was like just multiplying. It was really remarkable. And just to get that kind of like, not just feedback, but it was sort of this, people wanted to help. They're like, what can we do? What can we do? And there's really not much you can do right now, but stay tight, that's what we'd say. Sign the petition, is about all.
And do you think that pressure from sort of ordinary civilians helps in some way?
It did. I mean, the petition, was just really just a way of getting people involved. But, he was out of legal options. There was nothing left for him to do appellate-wise. And it really shouldn't be this way, but, a story or someone's story shouldn't really be the thing that's changing the outcome. It should be the system, the judiciary, something. It shouldn't come down to a story. But what I've learned just from working on the stories that I worked on is like sometimes it does take a story. And it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm the one. It really means that someone else picks up the story and does something with it. I'll give you an example. After Devil in the Grove came out in 2012, this is the story of the Groveland Four who were, it's kind of like a To Kill a Mockingbird type case, but it was really forgotten, even in Florida history. And even though Thurgood Marshall was involved, it was on the headlines at the time and it just disappeared. People were just unaware of it. Some kid, it was like a 20-year-old kid, was at the University of Florida in a history class, and he was reading it and for his class, and on his way home to Fort Lauderdale, where he lived, he drove through Lake County and drove through some of these towns, and he was just, the story spoke to him for some reason. He was half Indian too. It wasn't like he was connected through some, relationship to people in the story or anything like that. It was just so disturbing to him that he went home and just started writing to his state representatives and said, you guys need to do something about this. And it was this kid, Josh Venkataraman was his name, who just really started this whole process. I mean, yes, I'd written the book and drew attention to the case, but he went out and started doing things and got some grounds. And the next thing you know, it was in the state legislature, and they ended up apologizing to the family. Governor Ron DeSantis, when he was running for office, one of the things he said was, this is going to be one of the first things I do when I get in office. And my reaction was like, I don't really believe that, but I mean, it just seemed like there's other things to do. But this, but on his second day in office, he did that. He pardoned the Groveland Four and set them up for exoneration, which happened, not too long after. So it's kind of corny to say this, but I believe it. One person can make a difference, and that's what happened in this case.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to believe that too. But when people hear stories like Leo's, even like with Devil in the Grove, I think they sometimes think of them as rare or extraordinary, but I think your work sort of proves that they're a part of a pattern here. And I wonder how you think we should think about wrongful convictions in America today.
Yeah, well, obviously I'm against them, but I feel like I want to say this because it's really, I think it's an important point. I remember when I was doing a book tour for Devil in the Grove, the very first place I went to was right into Lake County, and I thought, this is really stupid. Why did I do this? Feelings were still raw about this in Lake County. I don't know who's coming out, relatives of the sheriff, the alleged victim in the case, I don't know. And I'm sitting there talking to people, and there was 2 threats against my life that came in that day. I was like, this is just really poor planning on my part. So I remember just talking to somebody after that, and it was a young black woman who moved down from Chicago. And she basically said, I have a 12-year-old kid who, I just moved him down here, and he doesn't know anything about the South. He needs to really be aware of these kind of stories. He's probably too young to read it, but I want to make him aware of the history of the Jim Crow South. And that book came out coincidentally, like within weeks of when Trayvon Martin was killed in Central Florida. So those fears that she had were real at the time. And I just remember thinking, like, that is just, what was your question? I forgot. It's so far off.
Yeah, about the criminal justice system. Yeah, wrongful convictions in the U.S. today. How they're a lot more common than we may think.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that was brought up in that thing. When I was telling the story, they said to me, nothing's changed. And I remember thinking, if you go back and look at what the criminal justice system was like in the 1940s, you wouldn't recognize it. Back then you could coerce confessions from people, and it would be legal. Hit them over the head in the jail, and then then they confess, and that's legal. So it actually was a Thurgood Marshall case that reversed that. Chambers versus Florida. There you go, Florida again. Got that reversed. And so I felt like it, to honor especially these talented young black attorneys who were risking their lives to practice law in the South, to say that nothing's changed kind of dishonored their memory, because they changed a lot. And so I always wanted to make that point. With that said, we've had at least 4,000 people who were convicted of murder who have been exonerated because of DNA evidence. So 4,000, that's a lot, and that's 4,000 juries that got it wrong. So it is an endemic. I mean, sometimes the bigger cases, the ones that you hear about, are the death penalty cases where people are on death row, and we still believe they may be innocent. But think about just regular first and second degree murder. They don't get any scrutiny after the appellate case is gone. They don't get the kind of scrutiny. And so there's a lot of them out there that I think we still don't even know about. I don't like to put a percentage on it, because I just don't see that there's any accurate way to really measure that. But I definitely believe it's more than 1%. And when you see people being exonerated, I'll just give you an example. In the state of Florida, and I don't know what the latest statistics are, so I'll go back a few years. I think the state of Florida, at one point when I looked at this, had executed 99 people for their crimes. They were convicted and executed. In that same time period, 33 people were exonerated from death row. So for every 3 people that are executed, 1 is taken off death row and exonerated. That seems to me too large a number that any society should tolerate. And when you look at cases like Leo's, you can see how it happens. Sometimes it's tunnel vision on the behalf of the prosecutor. Sometimes it's bias. Sometimes it's police incompetence. And then there's sometimes when the prosecutor just wants to win at all costs and is willing to do it, get a conviction in a very unethical way. And that's what happened in Leo's case.
Yeah, and this past year, there were more executions than anywhere else in the country in the state of Florida.
Right.
And a historic number.
Right?
Was it 40%? And a historic number.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, because you began that answer with a lot of, it seemed to me, optimism about the justice system. And I'm wondering, because you are so steeped in these stories of injustice, and 2 things. I'm wondering if you do have an optimistic outlook in where we're headed, and also, how do you emotionally sustain the stamina to sit with this for these, this length of time?
I'll answer the first part, then you may have to remind me on the second part. The first part, I don't know, I'm just being honest, I do feel fairly optimistic. And one of the reasons is I go to a lot of state attorneys' offices and prosecutors and talk to prosecutors. And, they're alarmed about this stuff too. And a lot of the younger ones say, like, we read these books, we read these stories, we don't want to be on the wrong side of this. And I say to them, somebody like me is never going to write a book about you being a hero the way like Thurgood Marshall or defense attorneys come out as a hero, because the damage has already been done. But you have the opportunity to be the hero before these cases ever get off the ground and become wrongful convictions. So by stepping in and just saying, there's not enough evidence here, I don't like this case, let's not just try to win it, let's just make sure that justice, and that's not easy to do when you have victims out there who want to believe that, are you searching for the killer or whatever. So, but I can tell you from personal experience, and this is all around the country, it's not just Florida, I do meet a lot of prosecutors who really care about this, and they just want to do an honorable job at prosecuting. I think it's getting better. I mean, honestly, if you look back at the 40s and 50s, you didn't have public defenders. You didn't have a lot of the stopgaps in there that help protect people. So, back in the 40s, you see, like, they would court appoint a lawyer who's like, he worked in the oil business. He doesn't know anything about criminal law, and he basically just sits next to the defendant like a lamppost. Doesn't cross-examine. And you see that all the time, and then these people are sent to their deaths. That's not a real defense. And so, yeah, it's definitely a lot better. There's a long way to go, because we're still complaining about the criminal justice system, and we see these big cases that get a lot of attention, and they're really, they're alarming. And so but it is getting better. I'll just say that it's getting better, but there's a lot further it has to go. What was the second part?
Part 2.
Oh, yeah.
How do you So I don't remember exactly how I said it, but how do you sustain the emotional stamina to
Yeah.
keep sort of pursuing the truth in these cases?
I just think it's like one of these things where it's not like I'm writing about a dead president from 1840, where like there's no sense of urgency that people need to know this, or else someone's lives are going to be different. With someone in prison who has no other chance at anything, like telling the story is maybe his best hope, and just that carries a certain, I don't want to say responsibility, because I was always very clear with Leo. I said, I don't know that this is going to make any difference in your life or in your case, but at some point I said to him, but I can promise you we're changing the narrative. I can tell you the story of what really happened here, and that I can promise you, your narrative is different. And then sometimes that's enough for people, to be honest with you. They just want to feel like at least my story got out there. At least this is what happened. And sometimes the state's narrative is kind of cherry picked, and then if there's not the kind of local media scrutiny, you don't really know anything else. And so Leo's case is no different. This was written in the 1980s, but it was really covered by mostly the Lakeland Ledger and a little bit with the Tampa Tribune and Tampa Bay Times, or St. Pete Times back then. But it was really, and you can see the dilemma that happens. A lot of times the crime reporters, their only sources are really like the local law enforcement or the prosecutor's office, the state attorney's office. And that kind of controls the way the story is told. And so there's all this other stuff that doesn't get in there because they're not really giving the same attention to the defense case. And so that to me is something that I think is really important. Almost all these cases that I look into, when I look at the original media of it, it's like, these are like two different cases.
Okay, for readers who want to understand, speaking of investigative journalism, what do you wish that more people understood about that process of investigative journalism and also narrative nonfiction, the process itself?
Yeah, I mean, I don't come at this from a place of journalism. I don't have a journalism background. I came through it through just straight up narrative nonfiction writing. And in that kind of writing, it's a little bit different. I don't have to do the both sides so much. I spent 5 years on this. Like, I've committed to a certain storyline.
Like, you don't have to be unbiased, you mean?
No, yeah, I don't. I mean, I just feel like at some point I realized, like, I know what happened here. Like, this is everything I'm learning. Whenever I learn something new, it always points away from Leo. And you begin to realize, like, all right, that's what was happening. In other cases, it was a little less clear. I mean, the Groveland 4 is, a little, I mean, I'm certain of what happened there, but it's a little less certain because you go back in time, you didn't have the kind of, resources and to look into these cases. And then I think the very first book I wrote, which was an execution in Louisiana, it's called The Execution of Willie Francis. And I'll be honest with you, I did not figure out exactly what happened in there. I know that the state's version was wrong, and I pointed to that, and it wasn't so much about who did it, but why. And that became a big part of that story, the why this person either did or didn't. But when I'm in Louisiana, I always say, just out of curiosity, how many people here think that Willie Francis was innocent? And it's like 50-50. And they know the case really well. The other half is absolutely convinced that the local deputy that did it, and they know the family, and I'm absolutely convinced this happened. And so I think that was part of the way I was telling that story. I didn't know, and I had to present it honestly like that way. In these cases, with Groveland and with Leo, I'm positive that what happened. You have to give attention to what the state side of the story is, and all that. You have to include all that, because otherwise you're not being fair to the reader. But I'm pretty clear where I stand on this.
Right. And even so, I think with Bone Valley, it's clear that you have such compassion for really every, I hesitate to say character in the book, because they're real people, of course, but for every story, even people who otherwise could be villains.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. I mean, in Bone Valley, you'll see, I won't spoil it for you if you haven't read it, but there's something really unique happens. There's a lot of times in these kind of criminal cases, you have something called the Sadi defense. Some other dude did it, and that's the defense. And the defense attorney will just say, well, it could have been this guy, it could have been a monster, it could have been this. In Leo's case, there were fingerprints that came back to a man who was that dude, who had killed multiple people. And so that's what made this story to me really interesting, is like this guy, him and Leo, they're both, have this story to tell. And ultimately, Jeremy Scott is his name, let me into his life. And I began to interview him. And it was hard you do not want this guy out on the streets. And I'm not going to advocate for getting him out of prison ever. I told him.
But at the same time, with his background and...
Right, I mean, he's just like abandoned, like his mother just wanted nothing to do with him at birth, handed him off. He was in trouble early on, going in and out of foster homes. By age 9 and 10, he was being arrested for felony charges. He had just an awful, awful life up in North Florida. And so like you definitely feel like, all right, this kid did not get a fair shake, but he's extraordinarily violent. He's got some brain damage, impulsive. This is not somebody you want out on the streets. On the other hand, what's really interesting that happened in this case was like, Jeremy started feeling really bad for Leo. And saying that this guy doesn't belong in prison because I'm the one who killed his wife. I'm the one who not only killed his wife, but I'm the one who took his life away from him. This is decades in jail, in prison. And so I felt like my relationship with him was really complicated. We'd talk all the time. I would send him books. He would read the books. We'd talk about the characters in them. They weren't the same books that I was always reading. Like I gave him Game of Thrones, and he loved it. And he would get so, he goes, Mr. King, I can't believe the author would kill off that many of the kids in this story. But I felt like he was getting kind of empathic in a way. We could talk about things. And I remember Leo made a joke, and I told Leo about that. I said, you don't mind, I'm still talking to this guy, and like, it's not just about cases. Sometimes it's just, and he was like, Gilbert, I'm proud of you. That guy's a part of my story. I like that you care about him. And he goes, also he's got like his own private book club with a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. Like, how cool is that? Yeah, I guess he does.
yeah, and it's all in here. I'm wondering, what is the deepest sort of research rabbit hole that you've gone down, whether it was for this book or any other? Even if it didn't make it into the book.
I've gone down some really deep ones. I think the thing that, anybody who does this kind of thing, I just really encourage you to do these rabbit holes, because somebody once told me, I don't know who it was, it might have been David Grant, it might have been Eric Larson, somebody great. They said, you know what, even if you don't use any of that, you're going to have the authority to have known this, you have done the work, and your authority is going to show in the book, and even if you don't use anything yet. And I believe that. I think the worst one I did was I was trying to find connections to people who claim to have not known each other. And I just remember going through like these yearbooks from grammar school to high school, and I got to like know every family in there. Like, oh, that's the guy who has the automobile ad in the back of the yearbook. That must be his daughter. And it just became like this, it's kind of like Game of Thrones. Again, you're creating this world, this universe of people, but it's Lake County, Florida. And I ultimately found like these two witnesses. One of them claimed he didn't know the other guy. Well, I found a picture of them on the same baseball team. They knew each other.
We've all been through this on Instagram or Facebook.
Yeah, and those kind of things are just really interesting. Looking for old photographs and so sometimes they really pay off. I'll give you the best example of one that I had was it was a book that I wrote after Devil in the Grove called Beneath the Ruthless Sun, which I also really, I guess every writer loves their book. I love that story. But anyway, it was a case that took place in Lake County 10 years later, a very different kind of case, but involving some of the same people. And if I tell you what this story's about, you're not going to believe it, but it's Florida, so you'll believe it. This time, a wealthy woman and her husband, she was sexually assaulted by a black man, which is kind of rare in the Jim Crow South, because it's like the most inflammatory thing you could be caught for, and it was dangerous. You could be lynched for this. So it didn't happen as much as people like to accuse people of. But in this case, it happened, and she reported it, and she described the man as a young black man with bushy hair. And the husband, who was out of town at the time, was the mayor. And he came back into town, and he got together with the prosecutor and some of his wealthy friends, and they basically said, yeah, I can't have it out there that my wife was sexually assaulted by a black man. What are we going to do about this? And so they changed the race of the attacker so that she wouldn't bear the stigma of having been assaulted by a black person. I mean, that's how surreal this was, how depraved it was. And so this conspiracy was always there, but nobody could prove it, that they got together and did this and framed an innocent, white, mentally disabled teenager for this crime. And they did this, but nobody could prove it. The reporters couldn't prove it. It wasn't there. And I was on Facebook one day, and I got a message from a guy, and he said, some of my friends told me you got to read this book, Devil in the Grove. I said, that's very nice of you. And I started talking to him, and he said, I worked on a case in Lake County that was much more fascinating than Devil in the Grove. And I said, what was that? And he said, it's the Jesse Daniels case. I said, that's the one I'm working on now. It's this kid's case. And he goes, I was the lead investigator on this. I said, this is awful, but he worked for the FDLE at the time. And he said, I told him there was a flood at the offices and all the files are gone. And he goes, that doesn't surprise me. That stuff happened all the time. He goes, but I wanted to write a book about this case someday. I kept all the files. And so I said, when can I be there? And I drove out to Pennsylvania and went through all his files with him. And as I was going through the files, there was an FBI report that was misfiled in the FDLE case. And I pulled it out, one page, and there was a witness in the car when that conspiracy was put in place, and he became an FBI informant. And he said they changed the race of the man to protect this woman's reputation, so that she wouldn't be a pariah. I was like, this is a smoking gun. You don't get these very often. But that was a rabbit hole. It's just like following up on some Facebook post and
it's like from a movie.
Yeah, it really is. And that's the stuff that just keeps you going. Like you get something like that. Like if you don't get it, you're like, I'm not looking hard enough. I'm not trying hard enough.
Yeah, you get obsessed.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll take a couple of audience questions. We only have time for a couple, so raise your hand if you would like to. Go ahead.
Okay, so
Go for it.
I'm not sure that the series that we watch on television, I'm not sure these series are helping very much, because you see the mayor who's pushing for a conviction and the prosecutor who's all about getting the win, and who's throwing stuff in somebody else's. I'm afraid to be stopped these days, because who's going to throw cocaine in the backseat of my car and frame it or something? I'm not sure that's helping us. So my question to you is, you've done a lot of work with the criminal justice system. If there were two things that we could do to improve the criminal justice system today, what would they be?
Two things to improve the criminal justice system today. What would they be?
I want to say something, but then I want to turn to Charles. Judge, what's that going? Do you think that's one of the things I think that's one of the biggest problems is this commitment to finality. Whereas when you're accused of a crime, you're innocent until proven guilty, and that's taken pretty seriously by everybody in the courtroom, judges, juries, pretty much, right? You can acknowledge that. But after you get convicted, it is flipped. Now you're guilty until proven innocent. And there's a commitment to respect a jury's verdict and respect what happened in that courtroom, and it's given a lot of weight. And when you look at some of these cases where you have incompetent defense attorneys, which happens sometimes, there can be a perfect storm of things. You can have an unethical prosecutor, an incompetent defender, and then maybe you're not always getting the choir boys and I call them the fuzzy angels of wrongful convictions. They're not all like that. There's a reason sometimes they're arrested. There's maybe a criminal record. So it's not. It's really difficult sometimes. But I think that commitment to finality is the biggest thing I see. That when they come up for appeal, like in this case, fingerprints turn up 17 years after this murder that come back to a known murderer who lived within a mile of where this body was found. That to me should get into an evidentiary hearing and let's look at this. But that doesn't happen. And what are the reasons it doesn't happen? In this particular case, I just think that the judges were committed to this finality. It doesn't help that they're from the prosecutor's office and that they're friends with the prosecutor. You see that over and over. So it just gets stacked against you. For cases that have legitimate claims of innocence, Leo Schofield, his story had never changed. He always said that he was innocent. He got offered deals early on that would have gotten him out of prison after 3.5 years serving time. He said to me, There's nobody in their right mind who would, if they were guilty of killing somebody and got caught for it and were offered 3 years in prison, wouldn't take it. Because the only people who don't take those deals are innocent people. He goes, I've been here for 36 years. I can do the time. I'm not going to admit to something I didn't do. And that, I've talked to many innocent people that they're all the same that way. Like, look into me, do everything you can. You're not afraid of anything. It's that commitment to finality that I think is the problem with a lot of these wrongful conviction cases, because they can easily say, look, appellate courts have looked at this. A jury has decided this. We got it right, and that's not what we know from exonerations.
Yeah, thank you. Go ahead in the back.
Mine is two-part. One, is Leo fully recovered from the motorcycle accident? And two, do you still stay in touch with him?
Oh, yeah. I wouldn't say he's fully recovered. He's got a ways to go. He was in a really bad motorcycle accident. You know, a lot of times, this is interesting, but a lot of times when guys who spend a lot of time in prison, they kind of become like ageless in a way. So they think of themselves as the same age they went in, because they've been stagnated. They don't have a lot of responsibilities in prison. They're told when to eat, when to go to sleep. You know, it's just encumbering. And so when he got out, one of the first things he wanted to do was go back on a motorcycle like he used to ride when he was 21, right? And he did that, and you know, I think he's a good rider. He's very conscientious about it, but somebody pulled out in front of him and didn't see him, and he hit head on, and he broke, you know, he almost died. Open book pelvic fracture, fractured so many ribs, like bladder was torn, all sorts of bad stuff. And he was laid up in bed for many, many months. He's just starting to walk better now. Like his leg was giving him real problems, but he's got a special boot now. I think he's facing a couple more surgeries, but he's doing better health-wise. Yes, I actually was touring around with him. I took him on a book tour around Florida, and we were just bombing around in my car, going to places, and he loves it. He's really, I wish he could have been here, but he actually moved back to Idaho. His family is from Idaho, and his parents are aging, and I think they're like in their last moments, and he went back to sort of care for the family for a while. So he's in Idaho, which is why he's not here with me now, because he loves doing this, and he's more eloquent than anybody I've ever spoken to about their own case. But yeah, I talk to him all the time, and he's in pretty good spirits, but he wants to be exonerated. That's what he's holding out hope for, because he's still a convicted felon in the eyes of the state of Florida. And when he goes to get work, because he was a mechanic after he got out, and he can't turn a wrench anymore because of all the problems with his wrists and bones and everything. And he can't get work a lot because they say, well, we can't hire convicted felons. And he runs into that a lot. And so it's been a challenge for him, but hopefully he's going to be exonerated.
And then you had a question?
After the podcast started, and especially after the book, were you inundated by people saying, I'm innocent too, do my case?
Yeah, that's one of the things that's, you know, and as someone who like really cares about this stuff, I just don't want to be the guy that goes, oh, I don't look at that, like just, you know, a form letter. I feel like I'm obligated, like that's the responsibility I've sort of taken on, like, because a lot of times innocent people are writing those letters and they can't get anyone to listen to them. And I just feel like there's certain reasons that I don't want to tell them. Like sometimes I'm not a legal aid society. I am a writer trying to tell a story, and sometimes you could say, yeah, this happened in the 1960s, everybody's dead, I don't know how I can advance this case. It's just, or, you know, I've gotten some where these are the worst ones. Well, I don't know if they're the worst, they're all bad, but like I've had cases where people have like been accused of sexual assault and convicted of sexual assaults several times, but they didn't do this last one. And like, as a storyteller, you know, I could see a legal society taking that one on, maybe, and challenging something like that, or an unfair sentence, right? But for a storyteller, I can't go in there and like say, yeah, well, he didn't do that last one, but he did the 7 before that. It's just not gonna work for a story. So those are the ones that kind of get frustrating to tell, but I always try to look at them at least and maybe like refer them to somebody if I can, or tell them to talk to people, you know, just give them what I know and try to help them in some way. But yeah, I do get inundated a lot. And, you know, I'll be honest with you, some of them I have looked into and I believe that they are innocent, but like, I don't want to leave Florida. I love working in Florida. So it's another state. I'm like, find somebody over there. I don't know.
There's going to be more, I'm sure. There's plenty of people. Okay, one last question. Okay, go ahead.
The prosecutor that lied and stuff. At one point you mentioned one of his cases, the Supreme Court of Florida changed the outcome, but did they ever think, has it thought that they're gonna go back into more of his cases and like investigate that he probably lied in a lot of his cases?
Yeah.
I feel like he probably got a pattern of putting a lot of innocent people away.
Yeah, I think that's one of the concerns, is like it's going to open up this big can of worms, and people are going to say, "Wow, look what he did in this case." Go back. The one that you're talking about was kind of interesting because this tells you how an effective prosecutor he was. He ended up a woman was murdered. She drove into a lake and drowned, and the prosecutor presented a case for murder against the husband because of some life insurance thing that was done like within a year of something like that, and went on and got a conviction and got this guy sentenced to death row. And something really unique happened. This does not happen very much at like the Florida Supreme Court level, is they overturned it, not based on anything but the law. They just said, we're looking at this transcript and like the state never proved the case beyond a reasonable doubt. Like they were basically questioning the verdict. Like, how could you get there? The evidence is not there. And when I looked into this guy's cases, I saw quite a few of these cases. Like he was able to get convictions that are a little bit, I can't tell if they were guilty or not, but like they didn't really rise to the level of beyond a reasonable doubt. And he'd gotten called out in other cases where he, hid evidence from, exculpatory evidence. In this case, he perjured himself. I mean, he lied. Like, that's one of the things, the tip-offs, when you have the defendant who's just swearing that he's innocent up and down, look into my case as much as you want, and then a prosecutor who's lying about the evidence in court, like, I can't accept that. I mean, to me, it's like, if you're a defendant, you're allowed to lie to save your life. But if you're the prosecutor and you're lying about the evidence to a jury and to judges, to me, that's like just way too far. And that's what he was doing, many times. So,
Okay, did you have a question? No, okay. All right, well then just to make sure we have time for the signing, we'll move downstairs for that. And if you have not yet gotten Bowen Valley, as I said, you've got to get this today. It's so good. And then also we have Beneath the Ruthless Sun and a couple other, right down at the register. But yeah, thank you so much, Gilbert,
thanks
for
so
being
much,
here.
Brent. That was really fun. And if you have any more questions while I'm down there, you can ask for that.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Brent. That was really great.